Christmas in a hunting cabin. So, this happened at Christmas a couple years ago, when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother along with my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea that my parents had had for a while. They always loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during a Christmas with their families. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time, I was newly 18 and my little brother Tom was 11. We were really close and do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd called Trigger, who came along for the ride too. He's a real softie, but can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyways, we left from our house on Christmas Eve at about 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Tom and I were really excited, winding each other up, and my parents were having friendly conversation as we moved along the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister, Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. They didn't converse for long, but Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins, so my dad helped her out by writing down the directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m. There were a cluster of them sort of spaced out around the woods. Each family had a cabin each, and there was one where everyone could just meet up with a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts. It was kind of a place we could all just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyways, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us. So as me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin and settled in for the night, my dad started a fire, whilst my mom made our dinner. It was great. The Christmas decorations were already up, and we played a few board games as the night got darker. Dad, Tom, and I decided before coming on the trip that we'd go hunting sometime, so we planned to go the next day. I've been a few times with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us, though, as he was too young to shoot. It reached about 10 p.m. at night, and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to bed. My dad kept his rifles in a bag, which he kept under the bed I was sleeping on. He'd usually keep it in a locked box, but thought there was no point, since we're going hunting the next morning anyways. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river. The view itself was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog Trigger, lying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now, this is when things begin to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. in the morning when I awoke to Trigger growling. I didn't find this particularly unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia, so sometimes when he can't sleep, he sits in our sitting room at home and watches some TV. Like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise he hears. But that's when I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never just sits in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom slept, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke Tom up. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard some deer or something outside. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open, and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever it was at the door. It was my dad. "Were you two just laughing now?" he asked as I turned to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied as he moved over towards our curtain, pulling it back as he looked out into the pitch-black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom asked as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing. Just go back to sleep." I was kinda creeped out that my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he turned our light off and we tried falling back asleep again. Of course, I couldn't. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching at pretty much every noise. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later I heard strange crunching noises coming from outside our window. I was sure this wasn't some sort of animal. It sounded like footsteps. I had this overwhelming feeling of fear, and I pulled the covers over my face, sweat beginning to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted for a good few minutes. I was so petrified I couldn't move. Trigger was awake by this point, as I saw his face turn towards the window, his ears pointed, and listening intently. The tapping started again, but louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. "I know you're in there, little guy," this deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine. "Why don't you come out here and play with me?" Initially, I was filled with rage. I thought that it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us, so I leaned forward and peeked through a gap in the curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the shit out of us. But standing there wasn't any of my cousins. It was a creepy old man who was around 60, his hair matted, and his clothes looked dirty and ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went to protective mode. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under my bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here or I'll shoot!" I felt adrenaline rush through me as the creepy man's eyes widened and the most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger began barking louder than ever I'd heard him bark. My parents obviously heard the commotion and came running through to our door, turning the lights on. My mom screamed as she saw the old man through the window. Trigger fiercely continued to bark at the man. My dad yelled at the man, telling him that the police were on their way, but the man legged it back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry more than anything else. How could some sicko do this? I was just extremely glad I had the rifle. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him. I found out a couple days later that the creepy man was homeless and living in the woods, and he was suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scares me to death to think about what could have happened to my brother if I hadn't been there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnight. There was no way we were sleeping in our own after what happened. We went home first thing on Boxing Day and never looked back. My dad only told me the other day that he knew someone was hanging around our cabin, so he intentionally left the rifle under his bed in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after he heard the guy laughing outside of his bedroom window, singing nursery rhymes. He knew it would take a while for the cops to reach the cabin. Safe to say, that was the scariest experience of my life. So weird, creepy old guy in the middle of the woods. Please, please let's not meet again. Why I don't like cabins. I was 11 years old when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made great money on his jobs, but because he was so heavy in debt, $500K plus, and my mom was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget, we never had much money available. This meant that we went on a vacation once every few years, but usually that was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a new movie. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it, and came back to grab Mom while we kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently the client he'd been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so Mom went into a panic frenzy of packing, so we didn't see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2.5-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook thing you could climb up to that was about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the 3 of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on the rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one. Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last rooms, which had a queen-size bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed without a curtain and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked and we couldn't get in. I never did figure out what was inside there. We went to bed at around 11. Belle is a kicker, so I slept by the lamp in case she ended up knocking it over. I remember lying there, and I must have instantly fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up, looked towards her, and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process that, and then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Belle with me. We rushed to our parents, who told us that we were imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed, and if we saw anything else to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them and went back into the room with Belle. We switched positions because she refused to go back to bed by the window. I told her a story to get her asleep and promptly conked out after her. I didn't wake up until morning. The next day, we went exploring around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we'd spend the day in the town. They had a lot of small shops, and my parents went into every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in the town, and finally went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remember everyone laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everybody stop. He took another step towards the cabin and pushed the door open with a single finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but didn't put the obvious together right away. "Dad?" Ariel shuffled nearer to Belle and me, but Dad gave his head a shake to let her know she needed to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two while we stood on the porch. Mom called out his name, and he called back that we could come inside now. We did, and found him standing in the middle of the living room and dining room with a frown. He locked the door once we were inside and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick chat. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Belle and me by suggesting another round of board games we'd been playing the night before. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad came back. Mom went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast while Dad joined our game. We played for a few hours before Dad told us we needed to go to bed. It was only 9 at that point, which made Ariel mad. She was allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and later on weekends. Belle and I went on to bed while they argued. We climbed back into the same spots we slept in, Belle by the window and me by the lamp. I read to Belle for a bit before we drifted off. I woke up to Dad rushing into our room. He scooped Belle out of the bed and grabbed my hand. He dragged me out of the room and into the hall, where I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by my mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine in the living room and saw our dog sitting at attention by the back door. She was bristled and seemed anxious. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand. They rushed out of the house and into the van. Dad went back to get our dog, and then he burned rubber getting out of the cabin. He drove all the way back home without talking once. It took a half hour for Duchess to calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Belle and I didn't find out until years later. He'd woken up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window in his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on, and found the front door unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl at the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got us out of the house. He went back the next day to get our luggage and found several pairs of footprints outside Belle's and my window. Cabin Man. This is a throwaway account I made after discovering the subreddit, and I wanted to share my story, so here it goes. It was about late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8, and my father got the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was gonna rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, my father, and my mother to bond. So that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took off school on Friday to get a head start on getting there, which I had no issue with. We got there and it was sure cold. Well, it was almost December, so I guess it made sense that it was so cold. Anyways, we got all set up and decided where we'd all sleep. We ate dinner and then we all got set up for bed, and we're thinking about what to do tomorrow. We got there kinda late, so we couldn't do much on the first day. That night though, I heard noises outside. It sounded kinda like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it must have been an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, then about 15 minutes later I heard it again. I woke my sister up, which she was 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't sure what it was. We decided it'd be best for it not to see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. But when we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast, and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for my mother to finish breakfast. I walked outside, and my father was talking to some man, a short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too for some reason. He was sweating a lot as well, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father. My father looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled and greeted him back, and it may have been rude at the time, but I was just a kid and asked, "You look kinda scared. Are you alright?" And he kinda coughed and replied with, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just went through shell shock. I'm a veteran," he said, as I couldn't tell already with the cap he was wearing. He seemed normal then. My father seemed to really like this guy, and I liked him at first too. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family and that they were really close to us, so he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast and he stayed, and it was normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My father was inside at the time, a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him, and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I agreed and went with him. I wasn't a very smart kid. I went with Patrick. We talked about what I liked doing, and I told him about video games that I played and stuff like that. Then, things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. I didn't know my shoe size. I told him my age though. He just kinda chuckled and said something along the lines of, "Good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back. It took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired, and there was no point in getting the band-aid anymore, but I still decided to keep going since I had walked so long. We entered the cabin. He told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there, no family. I asked him where his family was, and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear. He locked the door. I then got kinda frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo." He walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and he'd put it on. I sat down, and he put it on me. He also held my leg with his other hand and rubbed up and down it and told me, "You're rather muscular, kid. I like that." I kinda got scared and immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him nothing, that my leg was feeling much better. I then thought my parents must be worried sick about me, and that I should hurry back. He insisted that I stay a little longer and ate there. I didn't want to, but I was alone, and if I ran, I don't think I could find my way back to my cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed, and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile go across his face. He nodded and said, "Perfect weight." I asked him, perfect weight for what? And he just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him if I could go. He told me no, and that things were just getting started, and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that too. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was a closed door. Patrick stood up and looked kinda angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. I then heard him yelling, "Did I fucking tell you that you could move? No! Stay the fuck where you are, have fucking company!" Or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly. Sorry about that. It was just my wife. She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today. He was smiling while saying that. I wanted to go. I then looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere, and it was really messy. He must have been living out of here. At that moment, his wife walked out of the room. "I'm hungry," she said. He looked pissed. "Get back in there," he said. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffing and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back into the room. I asked him where his kids were. He didn't answer. He told me he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on. That was the last straw. I had to get out of that situation, and I didn't know how. I started crying, and then he hugged me. He told me, "It'll be okay, little one. Nothing is gonna happen. Just try on these clothes." He walked in the back room. I thought that was the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door and tried to leave as quietly as possible. I didn't care if I got lost anymore. I just didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick, if that was even his name. I had a feeling he had been lying. He lied about having kids, so who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear shouting. I heard him yelling to his wife, things along the lines of, "Where did he go? Where the fuck did he go? I knew I shouldn't have left him alone. You probably let him leave, motherfucker." I could have sworn I heard him call her whore and bitch a couple times as well. Then it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps. I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside, and seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for something. He then stepped out in the forest and heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay. You can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes. And I have toys in my cabin. All you have to do is come back." I then ran. I ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes to find somebody in my family. I was running away, and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to hear it. Then after about an hour of running, I saw a cabin. My cabin. I ran to it. My dad was outside looking around, looking for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy and that he was really weird and was touching my legs and stuff. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, and he said that nobody had rented that cabin. My father looked at me and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day and asked for a refund for the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man having the cabin rentals called the police, and the police went back there and checked the cabin, and there was nobody back there, not even his wife. His clothes and belongings were still there, is what they told us. Nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left. They never called us or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife, and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived back in that cabin. He seemed to have lived there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would be coming after him because he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that'll never get answered. I'm just glad that it's all over, and I hope I never have to see the cabin man again.